Alright, so obviously I'm a little more behind on the reviews and verses than I wanted to be, but in the meantime I had to just go with something that was going to be rather quick. So, of course, why not go into the second video of this Stephen King series and talk about Battleground, which is a story from Night Shift that is like 9 pages long and has a very simple concept and a very simple execution. And the interesting thing about that is, despite the fact that it comes from Night Shift, it was the first episode of this Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries that TNT put out in 2006, I want to say. And this also has a couple from Everything's Eventual in it also. Like, they just kind of did a whole bunch of mixing, but I guess the Nightmares and Dreamscapes name was more appealing or something. But and this is brought to it. This episode in particular is brought to us by Brian Henson, who is the son of Jim Henson, and that might sound weird at first, but then you kind of start to put two and two together and you figure out how that probably came to be. So, I'm talking about the very simple concept and stretching that out to, and it's the thing, is the story is so short, at just like 9 pages. Yes, you even need to find ways to stretch it out as much as possible to fit a TV episode, because these episodes were about an hour themselves, like by themselves without, you know, ads or anything. I want to say they were like 55 minutes or something. This one was for sure. So what's interesting about this episode actually pulls off is, number one, it is probably a bit of a hard concept to imagine being translated to the screen in any way, whether it be a movie or TV. Regardless of some of the shit that is, you know, shown up on TV, even that has its, you know, standards. But I think one of the biggest ways they could have pulled this off in the way that they do is to bring in an actor with the gravitas of William Hurt to straight-face his way through this as much as possible, regardless of the story itself and the episode having, kind of maintaining that darkly comedic thing, because you can't get away from that in this story. It's going to be there at least a little bit. But they were able to actually capture and make something that didn't entirely delve into that. Like, it could have pretty much went straight into, oh, this is just campy, so we're just going to treat it as such the whole time. But the fact that they actually do it as straight-faced as possible and found an actor that was willing to do that and do it very effectively is why I think this episode came out so well. Because this could have been something that probably failed miserably, and you could tell they had huge confidence given it's the first episode of the series. So they were obviously happy with how it came out, and you can probably see why. And what I like about it, as far as expanding, is the whole concept of the character of Renshaw is described in the book as being basically built by his environment and built by the world to do two things, which is to kill and survive. Well, we know survive is eventually going to come into it if we know the concept, but as far as the kill aspect goes, yes, he is going to have to kill his way out of this to an extent, or try his best to, but the kill seems to mainly refer to the fact that, obviously before the goings-on of this story, he is a hitman of sorts, and which we have very vague details on. And what's really interesting is the whole hitman thing is like the first 20 minutes or so of the episode. That's about 55 minutes in total. That's a pretty big chunk of it to devote to what exactly it is that he does before he gets it. Because there is obviously a whole chain going on and it's connected to what's happening in the main story. But what's interesting about bringing that up and having that much focus on it is that, not even an exaggeration, the entire first, like, 20 minutes or so of the episode focused on him being an assassin, where he goes in and the guy he's supposed to assassinate is played by Bruce Spence from The Road Warrior. And that whole thing is one small paragraph right here. And it is so, like, we have the whole build-up where he puts on, like, the eerie mask that, like, completely, you know, hides the distinct features of his face. He goes in, he does the whole thing, he gets up to the dude, and then kills him. Is whittled down in the story to just really even these couple of sentences. Someone had wanted Morris out of the way and had gone to the organization. The organization, in the person of Calvin Bates, had talked to John Renshaw. Pow, mourners please omit flowers. That's it. The episode managed to stretch that to 20 minutes. But I'm glad that they did, because I like the way that it splits up those two things really well in regards to what the book says made, or what he was made into, was to do those two things. And I like that it's one half is the kill side, and then one half is the survival side. Which, like I said, obviously the kill eking its way into the second half as well, naturally. But then you've also got some stuff in that scene where he kills Morris with, like, the toys and, like, the foreshadowing, where it's like the toys are there, and they got those weird faces, and it's almost like the way it cuts to them, it's like they're watching this murder happen, and then the whole thing about those toys kind of almost seemingly supernaturally popping up in places just with him going home. And then, so that's kind of like a nice bit of, they use the foreshadowing to give the whole thing kind of an eerie quality, which I do like before we even get to the whole thing, the center of the whole thing. And of course, one of the things that I remember, I feel like I remember when this first came, I didn't see it for a long time, but I feel like I remember when it first came out in 2006, actually hearing about how much everybody went crazy for the idea that this has no dialogue. Like, the whole 55 minutes is no dialogue whatsoever. And the interesting thing is you can tell that was a conscious decision, because while brief, there is dialogue in the book when he talks to the clerk, the front desk clerk. And it's only like a couple of lines, but still, it's like, that means they made the conscious decision to say, no, we won't even have that. Just no talking whatsoever. And for the most part, they find great ways around that, whether it be the backstory on Morris, how he sees it on the news, and we see the captions, because that's actually, like, the way the news is shown in public places like that, is just on mute with the captions, so it makes perfect sense. And the idea to give him earbuds, like, that he wears constantly when he's in public, so nobody has reason to talk to him. So there's that. There are times where, I mean, it does work, like when Mia Sarah asks him for gum while she's sitting there on the plane with him, and she just kind of mouths it because he's got the earbuds in. But then there's other cases, like on the plane when the woman hands him his drink, or when the woman is outside with the package. It's like, these are situations where somebody probably would be talking. And you can tell they're kind of reaching for the whole, they had to really go for the whole, oh, we really, really don't want dialogue here, but it'll be as close as humanly possible. And we may be stretching just a little bit, but overall, it works. And like I said, the way they find ways around it are still quite clever and overpower the stuff that seems a bit more forced. And I also love the idea of the no dialogue thing, because it kind of adds a surreal quality to it, especially if you don't know that going in. It might catch you off guard. Like, it may be one of those things where you may not realize it right away, but then once you do, it's... I said, sometimes it makes itself obvious enough pretty easily in some of those cases, or pretty early in some of those cases, but then it's kind of hard to not tell. But when it is kind of starting to blend in, it just kind of has this, and talking about it being a surreal quality, that's probably a good way, that's probably the best way to go when you're not necessarily going the darkly comic route, because the thing about this, that maybe would have been difficult to translate. I think they did it pretty well, especially with the way they show the wounds and how real the wounds look, especially after he gets his hands cut by the helicopters. But it's like, the way the book describes how it feels to him when he's getting shot by these tiny army men. And he talks about how it's like, it feels like bee stings and needles, and the way it like gets into the description of that, and like how deep the wounds feel when he's getting like stabbed in the ankles or something. And it's like, that actually really brings it to life in a way that I feel like would have been hard to translate. But I said the effects are so good, like the wound effects. Not even all the other effects that are going on in this. Just the wound effects alone. I think because of how practical they look, is so. It kind of brings that to life in a way that also makes it a little hard to immediately dismiss it as, well, this is just the silliest concept I've ever seen. Once it kind of establishes itself as he's actually in danger, then there's kind of a fun quality to it where it feels like a nice balance of, oh shit, he's genuinely in danger, and how ridiculous this is. And it just finds that kind of perfect balance, and it doesn't feel like it needs to... It's like kind of a constant blending of them after a while, that it doesn't really have to go outside of one way or the other. And they do add some things in here like that aren't in the book, like the idea of them being under the pool, like under the water, and he can't see them, and he thinks they're gone at this point. I'm gonna call that a pool. I'm not quite sure exactly. I don't know if that's deep enough to be called a pool or what that's supposed to be. His rich person water thing that he wades in. Somehow some of them are underneath there, and I like that it's never revealed, like, how. We just see the water, and we know they're under there, and like, that's a really nice creepy shot of that. And then the idea of going all out with this sort of elevator climax. Because obviously you're going to get left with a lot of people wondering, like, oh, could he just not get out of that room in some way? So to kind of take him out of the room in more ways than one, they do the ledge thing that's in the story, but then there's also the whole elevator climax, which is really good, and a really good way to end it also, because it kind of brings in the whole... the claustrophobia kind of has to play a part in this also, except for the parts where he's on the ledge, of course. And so to close him up in like that small space, and it's like... But it is one of those cases where you kind of try to talk your way out of it, and you're like, well, couldn't he just do this? And it's like, well, surely there's stairs in this place, for God's sake. And it's like, the elevator, is that really the way you want to go? But it's like, you imagine how they get, like, there's the helicopter that stalks him while he's on the ledge, and obviously they end up in the elevator. They can end up anywhere. They're in his damn pool thing. He would have probably had quite a battle on his hands if he also took like a stairway or something, and they would have had so much access to him, especially from like above. So it's like, it was really just there's a chance the elevator will be faster. That's about the extent of the pros. The cons list is the rest of it, so fuck it. And of course, this ends up being his demise, despite the fact that they do manage to, even though it's done a different way, they manage to keep the same final payoff, which is also kind of like the final sort of comedic, like darkly comedic thing they add on at the very last minute. That definitely feels like just a sick sense of humor at work in the best possible way. And some like, as far as how well made it is, like whether it be the effects or just the way it looks. Some of the shots we get are genuinely cool, like when we actually see him through the cockpit of the helicopters is actually really well done. There is that whole thing where it keeps cutting to black, which is really weird and kind of gets annoying, and I don't think... That's definitely not... I'm sure they used it for cuts to commercials when it actually aired, but it happens so frequently you can tell it's not just that. It's like some weird, like, floors or something that the director was going for. I don't know. But kind of to transition from scene to scene, and it's kind of weird. But no, it's, as hard as it may be to believe, I'm pretty sure the commercials did not happen that frequently. Like, sometimes they're like 30 seconds apart. So that's kind of weird and distracting when it happens, but overall, it does work. Sometimes they are held back by the TV thing, like for instance, there's the moment in the book when they slip the paper under the door that just says surrender, which is hilarious. And he, for some reason in the story, he writes back the word nuts in all capital letters, and it's like, it is, as soon as the adaptation was happening, once you know there's an adaptation, you're like, okay, surely they're going to change that, and I feel like I know what they're going to change it to. And if this were a movie, it definitely would have just said fuck you. But of course, because we're on TV, it says screw you, but it's like, it's the same sort of satisfying, yep, I had a feeling if anybody's going to adapt this, that's what they would change the note to. Of course. So, yeah, that's pretty much all this really is. There's not a shitload. You would think there isn't a shitload to talk about, but there kind of is, believe it or not. Obviously, more so with the episode than the story, but obviously the descriptions and stuff, and kind of like we talked about with Graveyard Shift, where it's like, yeah, there will be some stuff that's like really pulls you into it that might be missing, adapting the words and the really, distinct descriptions to this TV episode, but it's pretty crazy how much they got in the episode. So, and how much they actually got that to come through. Like I said, most admirable because of this concept. But holy shit, they managed to actually make an adaptation of this story work on the screen. It's kind of crazy. So, we're going to leave this at this, I think. The next one, I keep saying I'm going to jump around in the books, and I am going to, but I do think the next one is also going to be from Night Shift, but it's going to be a feature-length movie, so you can try to figure out what that's going to be. There's a few feature-length movies that'll come from this, but we'll go into one of them the next time we do this. So, yes, as I said, I'm going to try to get to some review stuff, like Vivarium and stuff like that, and a few more. I have a whole list of verses I want to get into, so we're going to be doing all of this stuff. So, until all of that stuff, I think that's going to be it for this.